Muy buenos días a todos y a todos. Bon dia à tous. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. C'est un plaisir pour moi d'être ici avec vous ce matin. You're probably wondering what an ambassador of the United Nations is doing on a panel talking about emerging markets. And I leapt at the chance to come and be part of this panel because as I saw the themes that were being discussed, it reinforced a phenomenon that I'm witness to more and more in New York in my current role, and certainly something that I saw on a regular basis when I was Canadian ambassador in Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil over the course of the last decade and a half. And that is, in this topsy-turvy, uncertain management world that we're living in, what I'm seeing every day in New York is people around the world putting a greater primacy on their region and on their sub-regional arrangements than trying to fathom where the macro global uncertainty may be taking them and putting their eggs in that basket. That's a real psychological shift, I would suggest to you, from the attitude that we saw in the 90s when we were able to conclude global agreements on a regular basis. But now, in difficult economic times, difficult political times, finding that ground is becoming more and more difficult, and people are focused on their home region. You see this amongst Africans with the African Union, Asians with their regional and sub-regional groups, and Latin Americans, certainly you see it in spades with respect not only to South America, but also to what is happening with Central America and the Caribbean. Where does that leave us? Because Canada, as many people have characterized, is really a country without a region, in the sense that we are part of North America. Our relationship with the United States has been singular to our development. But I would suggest to you this morning that what we need to do is to begin to consider the Americas as our home region. That's not to say that we shouldn't be engaging with Asia, with Europe, with Africa. We need to do that because we all understand that the world is global. But we need to build on the foundations that we have established in this part of the world and integrate ourselves even further than we have, I would suggest, with the Americas and with the future of the Americas. And as our speakers have said this morning, there's a lot already happening with the Americas that we have to build on. We didn't arrive in the Americas yesterday. We arrived in the Americas in the late 19th century. In the 1890s, it was Canadian banks that administered the customs in the ports of Cartagena and Barranquilla in Colombia. It was Canadians that brought hydroelectricity to Rio and Sao Paulo in Brazil. Less known is that Canadian capital and engineering also brought hydroelectricity to Mexico. But then the Mexican Revolution happened and everyone forgot about that. But the reality is that the Americas today is hugely important to us and our economic well-being going forward. I think our government understands that. I think Canadians understand it. And I was really encouraged to read some polling from Ipsos Reid from last year, and I'm looking forward to the next poll that they plan to do, I think, in 2013, with respect to how Canadians see the Americas. And the sample is not a large one, but it's still cross-country from coast to coast. And this polling data, when Canadians were asked if our interests were very or somewhat linked with the United States, no surprise, 96% of Canadians said that they were. Interestingly, 77% of the people polled said our interests were very or somewhat linked with Mexico. And 64% thought that they were very or somewhat linked with South America and Central America, and 53% said with the Caribbean. And the bulk of that polling data demonstrates that it is the economic dimension of these relationships with Latin America and the Caribbean that drives our level of interest. Well over half of the respondents in this polling data indicate that it is economic activity. Why is that? Because Canadian companies over the course of the last 2 decades have integrated themselves, whether in Mexico, whether in Brazil, with the Americas as never before. But I would suggest to you this morning, we're still at a very, very incipient stage. There are only 2,600 Canadian companies present in Mexico. There are less than 500 Canadian companies present in Brazil. And if you want to be successful in Peru or in Colombia or Chile, as Jonathan just said, you have to be there. And obviously, for a small and medium-sized company, you can't be everywhere. You have to make choices. And this is, I think, the nature of what we as Canadians need to do over the course of the coming years, taking advantage of the opportunities in a region that has weathered the economic storm globally very, very well, is poised to, I think, reap the whirlwind in terms of its positioning for the future, but is not without its challenges, and I'd like to come back to those at the end of the presentation. But I think I can stand and say here to you today that the Americas is a foreign policy priority for Canada. And Canada's engagement with the Americas is on three interconnected and mutually reinforcing objectives. First of all, economic, from a prosperity perspective, democratic governance, supporting that trend in the region that transpired in the early 1990s with respect to democracy, moving away from dictatorship, not in all, but in most parts of the Americas. And then security, which clearly is the most compelling short-term challenge in this region, but not the only one as the region goes forward. To advance these objectives, what Canada's tried to do is reinforce our bilateral relationships. We have negotiated and concluded more free trade agreements with Latin America and the Caribbean than with any other part of the world. And there's a reason for that. One, proximity matters, and two, you need an enabling environment to allow Canadian companies to participate successfully as investors and as traders with countries, and it is through free trade agreements that we get the legal underpinning, if you will, to allow that to transpire. We're encouraging partnerships among business, amongst academics, non-governmental organizations in the hemisphere, and we are expanding Canada's presence in the region because I think we have understood that our economic future to a large extent is going to be inextricably linked with this home region as we engage on a global basis around the world. I think Canada is committing to increasing prosperity in the region, both through the promotion of sustainable economic growth and the liberalization of trade and expanding trade and investment ties. But this is not a unitary view in the region. There are other models that work. You have countries in the region who are going backward in time, looking to solutions that didn't work perhaps in the past to try to solve their problems of today and the future. In my judgment, they have erred in those decisions, but that is their right as sovereign countries to go in that direction, and should that change, and should their populations vote for a different course, then we will need to support and sustain them in moving forward. The reason that Latin America and the Caribbean, I think, has the foundations for moving forward in a positive direction is that it has a lot of key assets working in its favor. First of all, its demographics. Latin America and the Caribbean is very different than our country, which is struggling with the challenges of an aging population. Most of Latin America and the Caribbean is highly youthful. I've been in Mexico for the last 4 years before going to New York, where the average age of the population is 26. The average age of the Canadian population is over 40. And this youthful population is now training itself through education and entering the workforce, and is increasingly moving into a growing middle class, which you see in Mexico City, in Sao Paulo, in Lima, in Santiago, in Bogota, in secondary cities across the Americas, where people are being lifted, literally over the course of a generation, from poverty and a lack of hope to something different, to a world where they can imagine a future for them and their children better than their parents. If memory serves, that's exactly what helped build this country and the standard of living that we have today. And that is what is taking place in Latin America today. And it is happening at a time of stable political environments, and Canada invests in that. We have participated as electoral observers in over 27 elections in Latin America over the course of the last 4 years, because it's important that the institutions of democracy in Latin America work to the favor of populations, and they have confidence in their governance as an agent of good in the world and in their lives. And I think that is something that we're beginning to see take root in many countries of the region. And the foreign direct investment flows from Canada, from Europe, from China, from other parts of the world are sustaining a level of economic growth and job creation in the Americas that we simply have not seen before. And it allows Latin Americans to envisage a scenario of encountering economic opportunity in their own countries, building a future for themselves in their own countries, and not being given the sole option of leaving their homes for somewhere else as a means of having economic opportunity. But it is fraught still with risks in the region. And I think we have to be sober thinkers from the point of view of understanding what is happening in the region. Yes, political risk remains. Yesterday's events in Bogota are a reminder to us that those political risks are still part of even a good story like Colombia. But gratefully, they are the exception, not the rule. The growing middle class now has expectations, now is having access to credit. That debt has to be managed, and that means that growth has to continue. The rule of law in Latin America remains complicated. And in Latin America, I'd suggest to you it's not a question of not having rule of law. Perhaps there is too much law, and too much law that is applied, and therefore cynicism is bred with respect to what is truly applicable. It was never lost on me when I served in Mexico that there is an old Mexican curse that says, "May your life be filled with lawyers." But, and an extension of too much law is a systemic situation in many countries where getting around the law is not only a national pastime in sport, but the way people need to get things done. And that has to change in the region. And my suggestion to you this morning is that steps are being taken in terms of legal reform across Latin America that over the course of the next generation, I think, will result in very, very visible changes in places like Brazil and Mexico specifically. Because we all understand that the challenge of corruption is such that if it isn't addressed frontally, and there isn't accountability in a society for those kinds of activities, then the confidence of the population obviously begins to wane. But in this region, Canada, as Jonathan said, still has a very, very good brand. The region, I would suggest to you, wants more of Canada. They want more of Canada by way of trade, investment, tourism. It should be a surprise to no one in this room today that Latin America and the Caribbean is the area that Canadians visit most. Over 4 million Canadians visit Latin America and the Caribbean every year, and I think that will continue to grow as we explore new tourism markets such as northeastern Brazil and others that are coming on stream. We have a huge corporate presence in the region. If we add Mexico, two-way trade exceeds $60 billion. Our total investment with the region exceeds $100 billion. This is absolutely crucial, not just for Latin America and the Caribbean. For our own well-being as Canadians, we need this region to succeed because in the terms of risk management, their success will breed our success. Proximity does matter. And I think proximity is going to matter more in the middle part of this century than it does today. And our linkages with this region, the region that we are a part of and closest to, will serve us in very, very good stead, not only in terms of our own competitiveness as a society in Canada, but also our interlinkages on the global scale. And it is those people-to-people linkages between Canada and the Americas that I think are going to be the cornerstone of moving forward. There are now in excess of 30,000 students from Latin America and the Caribbean studying in this country every year. That's a good start. We need to try to get it to 60,000 in my judgment, because this is fertile ground for us. And certainly, if you look at the initiative being taken in Brazil to send 100,000 of their best students every year abroad to study engineering and sciences, this is an area where we as Canada can collaborate quite closely with them, and something we might want to take thought of in terms of our own national strategies as well. But I said there are risks, and I'd like to just talk about 3 that I think Latin America and the Caribbean will need to focus on if it is going to consolidate the position that it has today and advance, as we think it might, into the future. And you may be surprised that while security is a challenge, I do not see it as a strategic threat in the region as some others might. It is a problem that needs to be dealt with from the point of view of combating transnational criminal organizations, and it is something where Canada is stepping up to the plate in a major way, with new announcements made by the Prime Minister in Cartagena at the Summit of the Americas of a new Canada security initiative in Central America, as well as what we're doing in Mexico and in Colombia through our anti-crime capacity building program. many of the police and forces, security forces in Latin America and the Caribbean are receiving training and mentoring from Canada, and they look to Canada as a source of the kinds of expertise that they need as opposed to other alternatives. So my hope is that Latin America and the Caribbean are able to successfully confront the security challenge so that they can then focus on what I believe will be the three largest structural challenges that this region will face going into the future. And the first, in my judgment, is education. Latin America and the Caribbean has some of the finest universities, some that have existed for longer than Canada's been a country, and in fact, almost from the time of the colony of Portugal and Spain. But they are producing skill sets in terms of the population that are not in sync with the requirements of a 21st century global economy. Latin America and the Caribbean need far more engineers, technologists. They need to be able to move into a knowledge economy in every sense of the way, and the Brazilian government, other governments in the region are quite cognizant of that, and I think that presents us a unique opportunity as Canada to collaborate with the region. It's no secret, John didn't mention it, but the Governor General in his recent visit to Brazil was accompanied by 30 Canadian university presidents, because it is these education linkages that I think may take the number of students from this part of the world, from the Americas, coming to Canada on an annual basis from the 30,000 approximately today to perhaps much more in the future. The second challenge that flows from education is competitiveness, because there are manufacturing bases in all of the Latin American countries that were created by and large in the 1950s and 60s when import substitution was in vogue, but those industries now need to be able to compete at a global level, and that requires skilled labor, and that requires the ability to innovate and to create patents, which is something where Latin America and the Caribbean sadly has been lacking. And they understand in many quarters, from Mexico right on down to Santiago and into Brazil, that this needs to change if the region is going to be able to really reap the whirlwind of its future. And the third challenge, I think, is a much more difficult one, and one that is going to involve a change in culture in Latin America, and that is the challenge of inequality. And when I speak of inequality, I don't speak of inequality in the economic sense. We can help, and policies can help bring people from a situation of low income to higher income, or from poverty to somewhere into the middle class. But it is the culture of inequality, the culture of exclusion, that I think is the Achilles heel that the region really, really needs to stand up and take stock of. It is interesting that many debates in academic circles among sociologists in Latin America is about the need for greater openness, because Latin America and the Caribbean, regrettably through most of their history, were highly stratified societies where opportunity, power were concentrated in the hands of the few, and the many were kind of left to their own devices to survive. If Latin America is successful in building greater equality in its populations through education, through opportunity, through the kinds of jobs and the kinds of future that we as Canadians have also utilized as the basis for our society going forward, then I think many of the countries of the region stand a better than fighting chance to be able to emerge by the middle part of this century to be huge and important economic powers. Certainly Brazil is already on the road there. Chile, Colombia, Mexico, which though not part of Latin America in the geographic sense, is very much part of Latin America in the cultural and thoughtful sense. Friends in Mexico used to tell me when I spoke to them that being part of North America would bring Mexico many things, but it would never make them Anglo-Saxons, and I think that's absolutely right. But, and in the Caribbean, I think there are particular challenges in small economies where they need to create a new basis going forward that goes beyond simply tourism, and this is something that they will need to struggle with at both the public policy level and at the education level going forward. But I can tell you, as someone who started life almost 30 years ago as a member of Foreign Affairs and International Trade in a job in Rio de Janeiro, which 2 to 3 days of every week consisted in spending hours in the Import Licensing Institute, chasing signatures for import licenses so Canadian companies could have their customers get foreign exchange to open letters of credit to ship goods. I can tell you that the evolution of the last 30 years in Latin America and the Caribbean is nothing short of extraordinary. It is not a region of perfection by any stretch of the imagination. It is a region of passions, and sometimes those passions spill over in a way that we here in Canada scratch our heads and wonder, how did this happen? But the reality is that those same passions are now taking Latin America and the Caribbean to a very, very different place from where it was in the 1980s, when darkness and dictatorship were the norm in the region. There are still some instances of that, regrettably, but I'm hopeful, as John is as well, that these will be addressed in the future. So this is a region where not only we have a stake, but we have the opportunity of reinforcing our own regional and sub-regional linkages as we as Canada engage with the world and see Latin America as and the Caribbean as the fourth pillar of our overall global economic strategy with Asia, with the United States, and with Europe. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.